Right, now let's talk about the configuration. And then we will also take a look at an example. I'm going to show you how to use this feature. And as a prerequisite, the first thing you want to take a look at in general is going to be the software version that you are running on the underlying managed device on the FTD. And you can either go to the command line and use the show version statement, like if this was the ASA. So I'm going to say show, the first thing I'm going to say, system support diagnostics UI to get to the ASAs, the Lina engine. You'll say show version. Right, so my FTD runs 9.8 ASA software. The other way you can figure that out, like if you don't really have access to the command line or you don't want to use it, you could go to the system health monitor on the FMC, then click on the device you want to look at. I have this one FTD over here, and then you would go to the advanced troubleshooting option. You would click over here on this button and then change the tab to threat defense CLI. So I can run ping show trace route. You will say show version. I'm gonna execute this command. Doesn't show me the, well, we should see an option towards the bottom that would allow me to run this command. Maybe let me just refresh this page. You're missing the one of the GUI options on this window. Right, it showed execute, but let me make it smaller. Show version. I'm gonna say execute, and we will see the exact same content over here. So at this point, I know that my FTD runs a 9.8 ASA code. And the reason you may want to do something like this is that in many cases you will want to compare the syntax, learn what syntax you should use to build your FlexConfig objects. And probably the easiest way to do this is going to be to go to the ASA, which runs the corresponding code, and then check the syntax on the ASA. Because you cannot do this on the FTD. It won't allow you to get to the global config mode. So you can use the ASA. Let's say you want to deploy EIGRP on the FTD. You check the syntax over here. So this is, of course, assuming that my ASA is running 9.8. In my case, these versions are actually not the same, but I know that the configuration syntax on the ASA that they want to deploy on FTD is the same for this particular configuration feature I want to use. So ideally, you want to find a matching ASA and test the syntax here. Now let's just finish this config. Let's just say network. And in my case, I will actually want to deploy EIGRP. Let's take a look at the topology here. I will want to use EIGRP on the inside, which is over here. And on the DMZ, which is here. So it's going to be this subnet and that subnet. Okay, I'm going to add it to the ASA. We will say network 172.16.70. I'm going to say question mark. It is looking for a regular network mask, not for wildcards. I'm going to specify this. We will say network 10.11.11.0. Put the mask. And let's also say showdown router. So I'm using showdown to figure out the full syntax for my FlexConfig object. I could also say showdown all router to see some of the default options like if I were to change them. So that's the purpose of checking the version in the first place and then using show run all to figure out the right syntax for your FlexConfig. Okay, now moving on, you will have to either use one of the existing objects or maybe build your own. And this is something that you can access from objects, object management, and then FlexConfig. Just remember that the enable and configure terminal commands will not be needed in the object definition. The device knows that those are actually to be placed, the commands that you will specify are to be placed in the global config mode. It also makes perfect sense to adjust the variables, assuming that they are used by the object. Remember that this stuff is optional. So technically you don't have to use variables, but again, in many cases, especially like if the config is going to be pretty lengthy, it is going to be easier to manage it with variables being part of the object definition. And those variables, they will be, in most cases, if you plan to use them, in most cases, you will define them for so-called text objects. Now, if we go back to the documentation for just a second, we go back to the variable types. I mentioned that the policy object type of variable is something that is defined on the FMC, and this is probably the most commonly used type of a variable. Now, the actual policy and system variables, you can take a look at the predefined objects and also the meaning of those somewhere down this document, like what the system variables can be used for. Let's say take a look at this one. If you want to use this variable, it is going to give you the device's host name. If you plan to use this system variable, it is going to return a list of logical names for interfaces of the device, like inside DMZ and so on. Versus this section here, this is for the predefined FlexConfig objects. And somewhere here, there's also going to be a list for predefined text objects, which are technically part of the policy variables. Because the policy variables, they can be of a few different types. And you can find the full list over here. Text objects, from text objects down to route maps. And now in most cases, vast majority of cases, you will be using these types of variables because they are generally meant to be used with FlexConfig. They say that these are highly flexible and built specifically for use within FlexConfig objects. Another type of the policy objects you may want to use is going to be network. This is for IP addresses. But the text objects, since they take pretty much any text string as the input, you can also use them to define IP addresses, port numbers, and so on. Security zones, this is for interfaces within sec zones or interface groups. We've got ACLs and route maps. So if you plan to use that type of information within the object as part of the config, you will probably want to use these. But for simple configuration like running a routing protocol, maybe configuring interfaces, I would go ahead and take a look at this type of variables. Right, so we've got the object, we've got the components of the object. To finish the configuration, we will have to deploy the policy, select the device, and push the object, push the syntax to the FTD unit. Right, and what we will do in our case, as I said, we will want to run EHRP on the inside and on the DMZ. Now, for the sake of this session, I'm gonna say that this is a wide area network, and we are running a customer edge device over here, where I will want to use OSPF between the outside of my FTD and this customer edge device. And at some point, I will eventually want to redistribute the OSPF learned prefixes into EIGRP process AS number 17. Maybe let me just make sure that OSPF is actually running between the CE and FTD devices. I pre-configured this, but I want to double check. I'm going to say show OSPF neighbors. And I will say show route OSPF. Okay, so we see that we are getting a single prefix /42 from the customer edge device. Right, so we've got OSPF, and this is specifically process number 1. Now I want to figure out the full syntax for my EIGRP. So I will also say disable auto summarization, show run router. Let's take a look at this. Okay, no auto summary command is the default, so it's not showing us this information here. And one more thing we will want to do at some point is going to be to configure the redistribution. So like if this is my process number 1 OSPF, I want to set the metric, and we will take this, put this syntax over here. Say this is going to be bandwidth, then delay, I'm going to say this number, reliable, and then effective bandwidth, the load I should say, is going to be 1. MTU is going to be this. Right, so let's take a look at show router EIGRP. Right, so this is the full syntax I want to put on my FTD. So how do we do this with FlexConfig? Right, we have to go to the objects and then object management. And from here at the bottom, we should be able to find a matching FlexConfig policy object. We've got the FlexConfig section, which we will be able to use for this configuration. Of course, another option is going to be to add a new object from scratch. You give it a name, you put the syntax over here, you can copy this from the ASA, and that's actually that's an easy way for this example. So I could put it over here, my EIGRP inside, just in DMZ. Let's just say EIGRP in DMZ. I'm not using any variables, so the variables list, I can leave it empty. I'm using plain OSPF syntax, no scripts, no variables. This is a really easy way to deploy a simple configuration. Now, if I were to use variables, I would have to first load them to this list, which is the purpose of the insert button. So this is how you load variables to the variable list. And you have to load the variable for the first time as you plan to use it, and then once it's loaded, you will be able to refer to it using the either $ or the ETA sign. Go back to the doc.cd for a moment. Let's take a look at the variable section. They say that the first time you insert a policy object or system variable, you must do so through the insert menu in the object editor. But then as you want to refer to the variable for a second or another time, you must just type in the variable string even when using system variables. So for instance, if I were to use the ifname variable, I would have to insert it for the first time using the insert button, but then I would be able to refer to this variable through its name, and in this case $sign. Right, but what I want to show you is more of like how to use one of the existing predefined objects to deploy this config. If you take a look at this list, we've got some objects for DNS configuration, EHRP inspection, ISIS, and so on. In my case, EHRP configure variable is what you will use to deploy EHRP. If you want to remove EHRP configuration, you have these two. So for a single IS or all EHRP config. So we will take a look at this variable. It's system defined, so I will not be able to change it, but it shows me the content. We see that it definitely uses some scripting language, and it also uses variables. Now the actual variable list here at the bottom is populated for some of those, not all of them, as we will see in just a moment. But this is what I want to use to deploy EHRP, so I will copy this object. I will just change its name. I'm gonna call it E1 EHRP, or let's just call it 1_ EHRP. I want to use a number so I can see this variable at the top of this list. Okay, now we will have to modify this syntax. Now, I will not want to use any type of advanced features like stop. Okay, redistribution, we will do this on our own. I'm gonna delete this portion. So this stuff we don't need. Okay, router ID, I will not be using this. The only thing we care is gonna be the basic network statement and the no auto summary command. Now notice that since this object contains variables, we will have to adjust them so that they match our configuration, which is here. And first and foremost, what we will have to define is going to be this, and also that variable. Now these are loaded. We've got EHRPIS, it's over here, it's on the list. We've got EHRP disable auto summary. It's also loaded. But if you take a look at the EHRP networks, it's not on this list, because this variable is not defined. I mean, it doesn't have an associated object in the FMC, so we will have to create one. But for EHRPIS, since it is loaded, we see that the default value is 1 for auto summarization. Disabling is turned off, which means that auto summarization is going to be enabled. We will have to change it to true, but we don't have the EHRP networks. So it means that there is no object for this variable. We will have to create it. Okay, so for now I'm going to save, and we will start adjusting variables for the AS and auto summarization. And these are defined as text objects. We've got the AS. I'm going to double click over here. We will change value to 17. I'm going to save. We will adjust disable auto summary to true. I'm going to save. And we will create an additional object. We call it in DMZ EHRP. And we will want to use how many network statements? It's going to be 2 networks. So I'm going to change the size of this object from 1 to 2. So change the type from single to multiple, and then tell how many entries you want to add. Okay, in my case, entry number 1 is going to be this. Don't forget about the network mask. So this goes over here. And then we will also copy that. I'm gonna save. Okay, what's the name? I call it InDMZ EIGRP. I just have to remember this name, because then when we go back to the FlexConfig object, and then EIGRP, not configure, this one, the user defined, I will have to insert a variable called EIGRP networks, which is gonna call out my object. So I'm gonna say insert policy object type text. The name must match what I use as a variable within the object, which is EIGRP networks, no $sign in this case. And I'm looking for what object? InDMZ underscore EIGRP. So the object name doesn't have to match the name of the variable. Well, of course, to simplify the configuration is good. I just wanted to show you that they don't have to be the same, because what really matters is going to be the name of the variable. The content is taken from the object. Right, so let me double check this syntax. If the router EIGRP, then the AS number. 4 hashes, it means this is a comment. The single hash must remain in the config because it means that this is a script. Make it clear, this is a comment, this is a script, versus this is the actual CLI command. No hashes, prepended. Right, so this is just a comment. We don't have to define this one because we will not be using it as part of the syntax. This one we have defined. This is a processing variable. Remember that you don't have to define those. They are created automatically as the script is being processed. And this is what we have changed to true. So we will have a match here, and this command is going to be issued. Now, one more command I want to add to this config as a regular CLI command is going to be the redistribution statement. Just simplify the last command. No variables for this one. Copy, paste. Right, I'm going to save this, and we will double check the syntax as we prepare the deployment for the device. So now we will go to devices, FlexConfig. We will add a new FlexConfig policy, FTD1. And then within the policy, I will be able to select the object I have just created. So user defined are on the top. Just add it. Now notice that this object was appended and not prepended. And we don't really have an option to tell if you want to prepend or append from this window. The reason is if we go back to the objects, I'm going to show you why. The append and prepend options, they are defined within the object itself. So go back over here, let's modify. I have this option, the type append prepend available over here. There's also the deployment type every time versus once. And now the funny thing is that now technically you may actually want to play with these two options. Let's find deployment type. What was that? Every time? Right, take a look at this portion of the documentation. It says deployment, whether to deploy the commands, it's the frequency. But they say start by selecting every time, and then after you attach the object, deploy the config. After a successful deployment, come back and privity configuration. And if the section labeled CLI generated from managed features contains commands that clear or negate the commands in the object, and the append CLI section contains the commands to reconfigure the feature, you know that every time is the right option. So essentially what they are trying to tell you here is that you may want to play with those. Now in my case, we should see that the syntax is going to be correct. We will save this configuration. So we can see the preview you have to save in the first place. You'll select our FTD and take a look at the syntax generated via the FlexConfig. So I want to double check everything before I push those commands. Also remember that some of the commands are not supported. So it makes perfect sense to start with checking the blacklisted commands, like AAA, like BGP, like copy, delete, interface, and so on. Now, the CLI checker, the preview should detect that, but I would personally check this just to be on the safe side. Right, so this is the syntax we want to push to FTD1. Auto summarization disabled, the network statement for both subnets, and redistribution. Okay, looks good to me. I'm gonna close, and we will deploy this change. FlexConfig policy is gonna be included. Let's deploy. And let's wait until this syntax gets to the FTD. Right, so it's going to take about a minute to push those changes. If you forget about the basic configuration approach, you can also refer to the documentation. They give you some guidelines, then they show you the actual configuration procedure, step 1 down to step 11. Right, it says the deployment is successful, and what we will do over here, we see that the EIGRP adjacency comes up on the internal, on the inside device, so IP EIGRP neighbors. Okay, we see that we peer with FTD. Let's say show IP, show route. And let's also say show RAN router. Okay, the actual OSPF prefix, we should see this one on the inside device, which is over here. We're learning about the 192.168.200.200. This is what was sent, redistributed from OSPF. This is coming from the customer edge device. Plus, we also see the connected subnet. This is coming from the FTD. Our configuration matches the syntax from the ASA.